Welcome to part 4 of this exciting debate between Bob Wenzel and Walter Block about Bob's book, Foundations of Private Property Society Theory. And Walter, are you starting?
No, I believe I am.
Okay, Bob, you're starting?
Go get it, Bob.
Okay. All right. So I want to go over, the points you made in part 3, Walter. But I want to start off with something. You said that a good title for my theory would be "Live and Let Live," and then I agree. There's a great element to that, but there's also something else, and it was actually stated best by Rodney King, the guy that got beat up by the cops, and then the riots occurred, and he said, "Why can't we all just get along?" And that's sort of my perspective. When I see anybody introducing any kind of laws, overarching rules for everybody, it strikes me as there's going to be battles and conflicts. So it's live and let live, but it's also, why can't we just get along? Let people do whatever they want in other areas. If we want to be missionaries and try and change the perspectives of other people, that's great. But I'm looking for the thing that can bring the most peace and harmony. Now, for example, Walter, you brought up the Sati, who Sati, my Hindu is weak, who some of them throw the wives into the fire when a husband has died and they burn her. Okay, now you're really kind of a busybody there by saying that shouldn't be allowed, Walter, because these women actually do it of their own volition. And I've done some research on this, and which is what I thought was the case, and I mentioned it briefly. But in a country that shunned widows, sati is considered the highest expression of wifely devotion to a dead husband. It was deemed an act of peerless piety. It was said to purge her of all her sins, release her from the cycle of birth and rebirth. Because its proponents lauded it as the required conduct of righteous women, it was not considered suicide, otherwise banned or discouraged by Hindu scripture. Sati also carried romantic associations, which some were at apparent pains to amplify. So there was a large case where these were really voluntary. And I've got one particular quote here. From a, here's one. Since in the period 1943 to 1987, there have been 30 cases of sati or attempted sati over a 44-year period, 1943-1987 in India. A well-documented case from 1987 was that of an 18-year-old woman. In response to this incident, there was legislation that came in. But a lot of this has been chronicled by a guy by the name of Robert Hardgrave. And I'm not going to comment on a guy named Hardgrave who's talking about women throwing themselves into fire. That's kind of a pun a Hindu pun that I don't want to go into. But here's what I really find interesting. At the end of the 18th century, the influx of Europeans into India meant that the practice of sati was being scrutinized as never before. Missionaries, travelers, and civil servants alike condemned official Raj tolerance of the dreadful practice and called for it to end, from Hardgrave. Now, so it was starting to weaken as a practice. And then came along the British Raj and another author by the name of James here notes that the outlawing of sati practice by the British was considered the first direct affront to Indian religious beliefs and therefore contributed to the end of the British Raj. So my point here is, let's get along. And if there's things we see that are barbaric, and I agree, you know, I don't see anything worthy of a wife throwing herself on a fire with her husband. But that's sort of missionary work and conversion work versus demanding rules and laws that it be stopped. The rules and laws are what got the British in trouble, whereas it was sort of shrinking on its own because of Europeans and missionaries entering the land. So, anyways, that's all I have on that. Now, I hope the New York Times isn't listening to this, Walter, because I'm gonna call you anti-black in your
Anything but that, Bob.
your calling for the mixing of water and labor with regard to ocean property. Now, I have no problem with water and labor mixing as a way of defining specific property. Again, I'm open to this. My argument is just that there is no sort of natural right perspective that comes down that must be recognized, and that is somehow a fair and just way. For example, and I looked this up, 70% of blacks, American blacks, do not know how to swim. So consequently, there would be a disadvantage to them in gaining waterland beyond, 3 or 4 feet in. Walter, you're a swimmer, so this might be a plot by you to sort of get more land. Okay.
Water.
Yeah, this might be a plot, and sure, it's just from your perspective, but there's sort of black people out there that may not see that the same way. So my point is that it's not that we should rule out the mixing of labor and water, but there's more than one way to divide it up. And if it's land that hasn't been divided up before, sort of the Rodney King rule comes in. Why can't we just all get along? I mean, the land isn't owned now, so let's just figure out a way to divide it up. If the moon's up there, let's get some scientists and divide it up. And then Cosi theory comes in, and the properties will flow in a manner that make most economic sense. Now, another point you make is that you can't make arguments to tell people to do something. However, are you losing me? I saw you freeze for a second there. You okay?
I'm okay now. I saw you freeze for a second, but I think we're both okay now.
Okay. And you said the only kinds of rules that can be made are rules where you tell people not to do something. But I'm not sure that makes sense either, as far as something that sort of comes down from heaven. For example, what if I tell you not to read Human Action? That's sort of not telling you to do something, it's telling you to not do something. What if I tell you not to sue the New York Times? I mean, they're both cases of acting in a negative, not telling you to do something, but to not do something. So I don't really see the difference there. Maybe you're thinking of something deeper that I'm missing on that one. Now, you also raised the point of when I talked about dividing the moon or dividing the ocean. You said, why not divide me? Why don't we, somebody claim, but that violates why can't we all just get along? Because I don't want to be divided up, okay? So, and there's great incentive for me to argue against that. And consequently, it's different than there's a moon out there and none of us control it, and we sort of get together, we either like battle for it or let it all go to Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos, whoever gets up there first. Or we can say, hey, let's sit down and just divide this thing up for fun. So there's a great difference than dividing up the moon and dividing up me. Now, the other thing I want to talk about is just this idea that the non-aggression principle is sort of hardcore on all things, and therefore can be applied everywhere. First of all, it's going to cause problems with people who object to the non-aggression principle. So we're adding in a sort of a violence into the idea versus just sort of accepting our thing and then using missionary work or just example to move people over to our side. And I want to bring in the recent case of baby Alfie, who was recently killed, in my view, by the British government. Now, the British government claims they acted in baby Alfie's best interest. Now, I'm not sure how they define the best interest of baby Alfie or anything, to kill somebody. I mean, there's apparently some theory that maybe baby Alfie could feel pain, although baby Alfie was unconscious. But I find that horrific, and Walter, I think you would find that horrific also. So, and as a matter of fact, it's sort of a extension of your eviction theory. I mean, there are people that were willing to take care of this baby, and the British government sort of steps in with the best interest. So it's a battle of best interest. And if you're not part of the government side that wins that argument, all bets are off for you, and possibly death, how they are in the baby Alfie thing. However, in a private property society, a couple of things could happen. If baby Alfie was at home on the property of the parents, and now I should add, for those who are not familiar with the case, that the Vatican had offered to provide health care or whatever for the baby, and the government wouldn't allow that. So, but in a private property society, that problem goes away, because if the baby is at the parents' house, they can certainly fly anywhere they want. And I would think the parents would choose. I would think in most cases, hospitals wouldn't be in the business of kidnapping. So they would have private property rules that said, hey, we don't, if you take your baby here, we're not going to force death upon this baby. That would seem to be a natural thing that would occur. And if there's some that sort of want to go by some kind of best interest laws, your parents wouldn't take babies to those kind of places if that appeared to be a possible remedy that a hospital would suggest. And that's about it. I'll let you go, Walter.
Okay, thanks, Bob. I'm delighted to be part of this debate, and I just wanted to say that since I started in debate 1, if we end in this one, debate 4, I think you should go last.
Okay.
Let me copy the order in which you mentioned. Live and let live, I think you accept as a rough approximation, and I certainly accept why can't we all just get along, Rodney King, as a perhaps even better facsimile or a better synonym for private property society. My problem, well, first, let me just put this in context for people who are hearing this for the first time. Bob's book here, I think, is a magnificent book. I think it's a very important book, and I agree with 80, 85% of it, maybe 90%. But as libertarians, do we talk about where we agree? No. Right. Do we say, well, we're against utilitarianism? And I say, yes, I'm against. You say you're against it. Now what do we talk about? Right. So naturally, we gravitate toward where we disagree. And we disagree on a very small little sliver of it. But that's pretty much all we're talking about. And I just want to talk for a couple of seconds about the part where we agree. And I think that the part where we agree is virtually all of it. And I think it's an excellent book. So I encourage people to buy the book. We certainly wouldn't be spending 4 hours on a book that had nothing to say. So just the fact that Bob and I are debating for 4 separate hours indicates something very important. Okay, Bob says that if we have an overarching rule, it'll lead to a lot of other overarching rules. I don't see why it will. And in any case, Bob agrees with one overarching rule, namely private property. I just add another one, the non-aggression principle. And I say that libertarianism is sort of like a two-sided coin. On the one side is the non-aggression principle. On the other side is the private property side. And I accuse Bob of being a one-sided coin. I don't think you can be a one-sided coin, but that's what I'm accusing you of. Look, you accuse me of being anti-black. I can accuse you of being a one-sided coin. Bob, you should have two sides to the coin. Every coin has to have two sides, so you're missing one side. With regard to Sati, I think we disagree about the facts. You think it was voluntary. I think it wasn't. This might be a debatable point, but let's put that aside. Let's suppose, arguendo, posit that the Indians pushed widows on the funeral pyre of their husband against their will. Let's just assume this to be the case. Now, I hope you would join me in saying that this is wrong. This is a violation of the NAP, not a violation of private property rights necessarily, because who knows where the private property rights are, where the private property is that they're doing this. But the key is that that's wrong. They shouldn't be doing it. You use the word barbaric, and I think properly so, but the only way you can derive barbaric is not from private property the way you understand it, because anyone can do anything they damn well please on their private property, including barbaric stuff, but it can't be barbaric if you stick to your side of the coin, because you know, what's wrong with doing that? What's wrong is it violates the non-aggression principle. Okay, the second point you make is this fact that blacks can't swim. Well, I'm sure you're just kidding about that, but if I were to take it seriously, I would say the way
70% can't, according to.
No, I have no doubt that that's true, but I think the reason you bring it up is, you know, not really a serious
Right.
argument. But to just deal with it for a second, the way we would determine property rights in water would be not so much swimming, but, you know, who uses a boat there, who fishes there, whatever. Now, this idea that, you know, this is the exact UN thing. The United Nations is sort of supporting what you say. So the fact that you and the United Nations agree on anything, Bob, ought to give you pause for thought, because, you know, the UN is not really our people. And what the UN is saying is that the Atlantic Ocean or the Pacific Ocean ought to be divided up into 7 billion parts, given that there are 7 billion people on the earth, and each one should get a part of it. And this goes very much against the Lockean, Rothbardian, Hoppian theory of homesteading, where the proper owner is the person who mixes his labor with the land or the water. And somebody in the middle of Africa who's landlocked and, you know, 1,000 miles from the ocean and has nothing to do with the Atlantic Ocean or the Mississippi River or the Ganges River or whatever, shouldn't own 1/7 billionth of it any more than we should all own 1/7 billionth of each other. Now, I appreciate your point. Obviously, you're correct that there's a gigantic difference between owning 1/7 billionth of a person and owning 1/7 billionth of the moon. But still, if you're going to take this 1/7 billionth policy or prescription, what I'm trying to do is a reductio ad absurdum. Namely, I'm saying let's extrapolate from that. Whereas from homesteading, you don't have any problem. Namely, the reason you own that body that's now in that pink shirt sitting on a blue chair, and the reason I own this body that's in a white shirt is because I've sort of homesteaded this body as you've homesteaded your body. So I didn't mean that as a serious suggestion. I meant it as a reductio of the idea that we should divide up the moon by 7 billion. Yes, if Musk or Bezos gets there first, they shouldn't own the whole moon. Nor should they be limited to 1/7 billionth of it. They should own a portion of it that would be proportional to how much of the moon or the Mars terrain that they used. You know, if they set up a boot camp, it's a square mile. Heck, I'll even give them 10 square miles because of the problems of intensivity of homesteading. You know, the more fertile the land is, the less you get, the less fertile, the more you get. So I'd be willing to give them a little bit more, but I have a principle here, and the principle that you're espousing, I think, is problematic. Now, with this idea of a rule not to do stuff, you know, you're saying, well, I shouldn't read Human Action or I shouldn't sue the New York Times. Well, the non-aggression principle only says there's one thing you shouldn't do, and that is initiate violence against other people, or the threat thereof, to be technical about it. And I don't see why that will leach into other rules, for overarching rules. The point is, yes, why can't we all get along? Why don't we have live and let live? Why not reduce animosity? Why don't we reduce fighting? Why don't we reduce controversy? Why don't we reduce wars? And yes, I agree with that goal. And I think that the best way is libertarianism. Namely, if we impose libertarianism on people, that's the best way we can have for non-controversy. It's true that some people will object. You say, well, we don't want to have the non-aggression principle applied everywhere because some people will object. Well, who's going to object to it? The only people that are going to object to that are rapists and murderers and thieves and other people like that. And they are the ones who are against, why don't we all just get along and live and let live, and reducing controversy. So paradoxically, the best way to reduce overall aggression and controversy and fighting is to impose the non-aggression principle on people. We say to the murderer, yes, you want to murder people, but you can't. You shouldn't be allowed to, because that's unjust. Whereas I think that the word unjust doesn't really come into the lexicon, or can't be deduced from mere private property where you can do whatever you want. Now, regarding baby Alfie, you know, every time I read about that, I just can't read about it. It's just so disgusting what the British government did. The parents were the guardians, and they overruled the guardianship. And how did they get the guardianship? Because they homesteaded that kid. They had sexual intercourse, and the mother kept that baby inside of her for 9 months. If they're not the proper guardians of her, then I don't know who is the proper guardians of her. Certainly not the British government. I'm sure you would agree with me on that. So the parents were the proper guardians, and they were trying to guard the baby. And the best way to guard the baby is to keep the baby alive. And these people violated the non-aggression principle. Now you say, well, the hospital probably wouldn't kidnap. And if they did kidnap, because the baby was now in the hospital, the parents brought the baby to the hospital. And you say, well, in the future, if the hospital were like that, no other babies would go to the hospital. I think you're absolutely right. But what about this baby? Right now, you've got a baby in the private property of the hospital. And the hospital is run by the government. And the government says, we got to kill this baby. And I say that you're on the wrong side of the baby Alfie thing, because you're right. In future, very few people are going to bring the babies to that kind of a hospital. They're going to make sure they only bring babies to hospitals that don't seize control over people based on your theory of private property. And again, I say, what about this baby? This baby in your theory is gone, and your theory supports that, whereas my theory doesn't support that at all. So I think I'm on the right side of baby Alfie, and I thank you for raising the baby Alfie issue, because it puts in sharp contrast the fact that people on their own private property can do evil, vicious, barbaric things. And as far as, maybe I misunderstand your theory, although I've read the book very carefully twice, the chapters where I disagree, you would support the hospital doing this because it's on their property. And yes, you're right that in future, this hospital is going to go broke and nobody's going to go there, unless the government runs it and compels people and whatever. But this baby right now in the hospital is acting compatibly with your theory, and I think that that's 180 degrees off of proper libertarian theory. Your turn.
Okay, so now I'm going to respond to your question, comments, Walter. You brought up the point that I can't use the term barbaric, but that's not completely true. I do not state at all that there isn't morality, that there isn't something that is justified and other things that are not justified. My only point with regard to the private property society is that we should leave each group, each individual on their own property to work based upon whatever their morality is, whatever they think is justified and unjustified. I remind you that even under the non-aggression principle, there are some differences. Murray Rothbard and I hold a different view on intellectual property than you do. You hold a different view on abortion than Ron Paul does. So it's not like there's these given tablets that have come down from God and NAP tablets. So if Moses brings them down, the Muslims go along with that. Who goes along with which ones, and then the problem is raised of atheists. So I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done in morality and injustice and all that, and I may delve into that somewhere in the future, but not now. So when I raise the when I call something barbaric, I'm calling that from my subjective, methodological, individualist perspective, not something that I am saying has to apply to all private property. I am just, and one of the reasons I do this is because people, when I say, people should be allowed to do whatever they want on their property, people then start accusing me of being barbaric, when I think there's a lot of these acts that are horrific. My perspective is that the best way to deal with these things is not by making overarching rules. Because when you put in these overarching rules, what happens is you're gonna get disagreements, and you're gonna get the first step away from harmony, peace and harmony. And what I'm trying to do is get the private property society is an umbrella. It's a first step to protect from all these attacks from all different ways. Then we can work on things, whether you're a missionary, an academic, to sort of spread your views and your ideas under the umbrella. But let's stop the battling in the wars. And the battling in the wars come about because people are attempting to gain control of central power, because they understand that is the only way they will be able to get what they want. But if we have a private property society where people are allowed to do whatever they want on their property, that eliminates a whole reason for the central power battling. And I remind you again with the baby Alfie situation, you've got a libertarian, the head of the director of the healthcare studies at Cato Institute, who was actually in favor of what the British government did from some kind of libertarian perspective, which I find hard to side with. Walter, you're nodding. I mean, how he gets that, I have no idea. But the whole point is that people have different perspectives, and if we start these battles up here, now let me go to the difference between a private property society and what we currently have in Britain, which is an overarching rule. Walter, we didn't win that debate. So because there is no overarching rule, anytime a parent takes a baby in the condition of baby Alfie into the hospital, they're going to kill that baby. The parents have no solution. Now, you state that, in my case, baby Alfie would have died, and then parents would have stayed away from that hospital. Well, maybe not. You would have to be a pretty horrific hospital to sort of adopt the same rules as the British government. But say they did, say it was a horrific hospital, then parents would be aware, and they would never go to that hospital. They would go to other hospitals. Now the parents, because we have an overarching rule, which we lost the battle on, versus a private property society, more babies are going to die. In a private property society, that wouldn't happen. My concern is it's the problem of if you see something going on out there and you want to fix it, when you start doing that, and you lose the battle. You lose the battle for control for central power. The suffering is going to be much greater. Hundreds of millions of people have died under government, under rules that were set by people other than people on their own property. And that's how I define government, is rules set by people other than rules set by people on their own property. as far as the water thing, it's really interesting. Now you're getting into another technicality, which shows the problem of these sort of rules that apparently exist in nature. You say that you see the ocean being divided by boats rather than by swimming, and that might be the case for land out there. But I know there's a lot of disputes right now in Southern California around Malibu and places like that, like who gets to own the shorelines and things like that. And it comes back, Walter, it's anti-black. But the bigger point is that you're just coming up with rules that may or may not apply, and so there's no sort of justice to this stuff. It's we have to divide it, and we get back to Rodney King. Why can't we just all get along? If the property is not owned by anybody, just figure out a way to divide it. It can be homesteading, it doesn't have to be homesteading, and so on. As far as the UN agreeing with me, that does scare me, Walter. I admit that. I used to live by the United Nations. I actually used to sit in the park and read the United Nations Park, right? David Koch was my neighbor. He was in the UN Plaza there. So the little history. I didn't live in the UN Plaza. Okay, then you raise the question again of who is going to object to NAP, and I already pointed out that Rothbard does in certain ways to your perspective on NAP, and Ron Paul does on abortion. But then you've got all kinds of other people. You've got people who really believe there are all these kind of rights. People think there's rights to internet and rights to home and food and all this kind of stuff. I mean, to convince all these people to go to NAP is a great I think it's a difficult enough task to try and get people to accept the fact that they should just leave people alone on their own property. Live and let live. Can't we all get along? I mean, we can't get along. We can't get that. Never mind the problem with socialists and people who think labor is exploitative and rules have to be made and minimum wage, it goes on and on. Let's see. I think that's pretty much about my comments, unless I have something on the paper. Nope, that's it. You're up, Walter.
Okay, my turn. You say you can use the word barbaric because you have a view of morality, and certainly on your property you would act in an amiable way, in a way that we would agree, both of us, because we have very similar morality. But there's a problem here, because then your system would support people acting in a barbaric way. And I regard that as a flaw or a problem in your system, because you would have to say, okay, here's this very bad guy, and on his property, he's acting barbarically, and I support it. Whereas I would never have to say that. I would say, oh, I'm going to go get that guy that's killing baby Alfie. I'm going to get him. Or at least justice would require that he be smitten. Yes, Ron, Paul, and I disagree on abortion. You and Murray and I disagree on intellectual property. These are very important points, but I don't see how private property would solve that. I think that there's one correct view on both of these. Naturally, I think you're shocked that I would think that, but I do. Now, you say that there's nothing from God or heaven that comes down. Well, I don't say that Hans Hoppe is God. I'm not saying that. However, his argument from argument stuff, I think, is very, very powerful. And I think he proves that anyone who denies what he's saying is engaged in a logical self-contradiction. So I think that he really cements this non-aggression principle in a way that no one else really has done. Yes, we want to have peace and harmony, and I don't think it's just an empirical issue, although it is an empirical issue, whether we'll have more peace and harmony if we allow everyone to do whatever they damn well please on their property, or if we impose the non-aggression principle on them. But I think it's more than just an empirical issue. I think it's also a matter of justice. And assuming that the Indians assuming that they did sati against unwilling women and wives, push them on the funeral pyres of their husband, that is rank injustice. And I'm able to say it's not only rank injustice, but it would be justified to stop them. Whereas you might say it's rank injustice and it is barbaric, but you wouldn't say you have a right to stop them. That doesn't mean the government has to stop them, but private individuals or God. If there's a God, God should smite those people for pushing innocent wives on the funeral pyres. And you wouldn't subscribe to that. You couldn't subscribe to that because they're doing it on their own property, arguendo. Now, you say if you have an overarching rule, well, then everyone's going to have their own overarching rules, like a right to food or right to clothing or right to internet, whatever. Well, you have an overarching rule, private property, and why isn't your private property vulnerable to that objection? I think it is. With regard to government sets rules on other people's property, that's not why we have problems. If government would limit itself to setting rules on other people's property of the non-aggression principle type, then we wouldn't have problems. The problem is that government sets rules on other people's property that is incompatible with the non-aggression principle, you know, the minimum wage law or something like that. So I think that now the puzzle as to why Cato would support baby Alfie's death. I think you'll agree with me on this. They're not libertarian. They're sort of libertarian. They're semi-demi libertarian on many issues, but they're not really Rothbardian libertarians. They're sort of I don't know what, Hayekian Friedmanite libertarians, which is a step or two below the Rothbardian libertarians. They're not really that libertarian. I mean, I think it's grotesque that anyone would support the killing of baby Alfie when the Vatican was willing to support him. So that just shows that Cato isn't as good as they should be on this issue. So that's my brief comment.
Okay, I just have a couple of quick comments in response to that. First, you say you want to be able to go and get the guy that killed Alfie. Well, it's the British government. It's Theresa May. And Walter, have you booked your flight yet?
Not yet, but I've called American Airlines.
I think, you know, that the NSA may have you now.
Oh, I'm kidding. I hope the New York Times isn't listening in on this. Yeah. I'm not going to do anything to May, Prime Minister.
May, yeah.
But it would be just if somebody did.
All right. Well, see, that's my point is that you can't fight government. It's very, very difficult to fight government that way, and it's much easier to do it on a personal level. I mean, if there's just some nut out there that killed baby Alfie, and if he's a nut, he probably doesn't have good security, and you could probably blow the guy away. So again, private property just is much better than government rule. When government gets in there, it's just very, very difficult to battle. Hoppe's argument against argument, I sort of see that as a just that. It sort of acknowledges existence of a person who's doing the argument, but I don't necessarily see where that comes in as far as self-ownership beyond that. And then the further jump that because you do own yourself, which in a way you do, why that means you have any rights. You know, a dog, I guess, pees to mark his land. I mean, he's kind of a private property. The dog doesn't have any rights. I mean, if we're going to put a collar on him and whisk him away, he's got a lot of problems. Now, as far as the private property being an overarching rule, I don't see it that way, because what I see with NAP, the NAP sort of saying NAP should apply to everyone, is given individuals, especially libertarians on NAP, but on other perspectives, it's a case where people are saying this has to apply to everyone. my private property doesn't come from that perspective. It's again from that Hayekian, methodological, individualist, subjectivist thing where it's not an exact fit the way it's used in economics, but it's close enough. Where I'm just making a deal with people around me and saying, look, I've got property. I don't want you messing with my property. You don't want people messing with your property. Let's just make a deal. It's not some kind of rule that has to apply to everybody. I guarantee you this, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Solomon, does not favor my private property perspective, and I doubt he ever would. Vladimir Putin wouldn't, and there's plenty of people that wouldn't. So it's not something that I say has to apply for everybody. I recognize there are people that would not be in favor of that, and the whole idea is to try and figure out ways, which I discuss in my book on the chapter on quote national defense, how to deal with that, and the general idea is just that first step. Let's not even argue about what your morality is and what your justice is. Let's just get peace and harmony by respecting everybody on their own property. And then from there, we can have missionaries and debates and academics discuss whether it should be NAP, whether it should be socialism, whether this goes in NAP, whether that goes in NAP. And we answer the great philosopher Rodney King's question, how can we all get along, So. And I'm there. So I guess Michael has a question, unless Walter, you have
a very brief point.
Okay.
You say, let's make a deal. You're a Trumpian. The order of the deal. I'm just kidding.
Yeah.
Okay, Michael, it's your turn to ask Bob and me a question.
Yeah. Shall I ask you a question first?
Whichever order you want.
However you want to do it.
I'll start with you, Walter. I think that although you're an advocate of the non-aggression principle, on your own property, you act as an advocate of the private property society. Let me give you an example. You decried clitorectomy. You said it's horrible, it's awful, it's vicious, it's a violation of the NAP. Yet on the male equivalent of clitorectomy is circumcision, and on your own property, you officiated over circumcision of your son. So that was against the NAP, according to you, yet it wasn't against the private property society.
You're a vicious man, Michael.
He cuts. I mean,
he's nasty. Michael, you make a very good point, an excellent point. I'm a hypocrite. I have published an article saying that not only should clitorectomy be stopped, but so should circumcision. And yes, my son was circumcised, and I made a mistake. I shouldn't have done that. I acted incompatibly with my own views, and you got me fair and square. Mea culpa. I agree. You've got an excellent point. You've shown me up for a hypocrite or someone who acts incompatibly with his own views. I should have insisted that he not get us circumcised, but too late now.
Okay, Bob.
Yeah.
Walter, we're all in a private property society, and Walter is in the process of having his son circumcised, which we're all agreeing is against the NAP. And I live next to Walter, and I'm an advocate of the NAP. So I go in, I'm a good Samaritan, and I go in and I try to protect his son. Now, wouldn't this be a violation of the private property society because I'm violating Walter's private property?
Yes, it would. Now, see, I think these are the most extreme, difficult questions, where we've got a situation where we sort of have this agreement, live and let live on our properties, but we see something horrific going on another property. Okay.
Right.
And I don't think there's been enough done by philosophers with regard to morality and justice to really work that out and explain that out. I mean, at this point, what I see is, Walter's going to presumably have some kind of security agency, and you're going to have one, and you're probably going to have big security agencies. So that this is probably not the first time they've come across this situation. So they've got rules saying, look, if somebody comes to try and stop you from having a circumcision, we've got agreements with these other security firms and things of that nature. So the only way I see you would be able to do that is to sort of do it on your own, and Walter's going to have a bigger security firm to stop it. So again, I think there's more that has to be done on morality and justice with regard to that stuff. But in this case, it's almost it's not majority rule, but if there's enough people on both sides of an issue, you're going to get stalemates.
I once said that since I had the first word, Bob should have the last word. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just say one more thing on the circumcision thing, and then I'll let Bob have the last word, and that'll be the end of the debate. Matthew, my son, is 40 years old. He was born 40 years ago. He had a circumcision 40 years ago minus 8 days or whenever it was. I first came to my view on circumcision maybe 4 or 5 or 6 years ago when a former student of mine wrote an essay on that and convinced me of it. So I'm not a hypocrite, or I didn't act incompatibly with my views. It's rather that my views on circumcision came about maybe 5 years ago, whereas Matthew's circumcision came about 40 years ago. On the other hand, I do have grandchildren who are now 3 years old, and my views on circumcision came about before that. And what I should have done is told Matthew, or asked him not to do that to his sons, which he did to his sons. But still, I escape hypocrisy because I didn't come to that view until 5 years ago, and Matthew was circumcised about 40 years ago.
Right, but since you believe in reparations, you owe Matthew reparations, and I'm going to persuade him to 50% of that.
Okay, I will talk to Matthew about reparations, but remember, it's sort of a post hoc thing. I wasn't really guilty 40 years ago of acting incompatibly with my views, because 40 years ago my views on circumcision were different than in the last 5 years.
I understand that, right? But you were, even though your views were different, you acted incompatibly with the non-aggression principle.
I owe him reparations. You're right.
Right.
So let me ask you this question, Walter. So has your perspective on NAP changed? What falls under NAP and what doesn't from 40 years ago?
Probably, although I don't think so. I think I was an anarchist before Matthew was born, and I don't think my views have changed. Well,
yeah,
actually, they have, because Stephan Kinsella convinced me of IP less than 40 years ago. So you're right. I have changed.
Yeah, but I'm thinking specifically of the a circumcision. You're basically, you now would consider that a violation of NAP, right? And you did it at that time.
Right.
So we're basically seeing that even within an individual, we can have a moving definition of what comes under NAP and what doesn't. So when we get these overarching rules, we're just making rules for everybody where there might be legitimate differences. And the best thing might be to have a private property society, and then we work and debate and have academics and missionaries and all that work on the society underneath. Well, and I'll leave it at that. I want to thank you, Walter, for having this debate with me, for the extremely kind words you've said about the book, and as always, it's always fun to debate with you. I look forward to it whenever we come up with a topic that.
I changed my mind. I'm not letting Bob have the last word. I'm going to seize the microphone. I'm going to get the last word, and my last word is everybody should buy this book. The fact that Bob and I spent 4 hours of interesting discussion where we got into all sorts of things indicates this is a very worthwhile book. Everyone should go out and buy the book. And I think that I agree with 85, 90% of it. I disagree with a little bit, but that's par for the course. I mean, Ron Paul and Murray Rothbard disagree on abortion. Bob Wenzel and Stephan Kinsella disagree on IP, and I regard both of them as crucially important libertarian theoreticians. This is the human condition. We all disagree. I'm getting the last word, and the last word is buy this book. Ha-ha, Bob, I got the last word. Ha-ha.
Thanks, everyone, for a great discussion, and I reinforce Walter's suggestion. We buy this book. I suggest read it twice, as Walter and I did, But unlike Walter and I, when you're about to read it second time, buy a second copy to read it.
I only bought one. I'm sorry.
Okay, thanks for a great discussion.
Take care.